Please help me bring up the one and only David Walker. So I'm kind of glad you took a seat, because I waited till you took a seat. 2 days ago, I interviewed Bella Caroli. I don't know if you heard about the story where we're standing up and I said, Bella, would you, anybody saw that by the way, would you like to grab a seat? 7 times I said, would you like to grab a seat? And we did the interview standing up. Very weird for an hour and a half, but we had a good time. I'm glad you're seated. It's more comfortable.
I knew that you were tired, so I wanted to make sure that we got a chance to sit down.
So we appreciate you coming out. Obviously, this is something we've been looking forward to for a while, of hearing from you, because there is not a better expert to talk about on this topic than you. So may as well go to the source. And why don't you, if you can, talk about your story of how you came about becoming the Comptroller General and what the responsibilities of a Comptroller General of the United States of America is.
Well, I was the 7th Comptroller General of the United States and head of the Government Accountability Office, which was created in 1921. And that's actually in the legislative branch. It helps the Congress oversee the executive branch to promote transparency and provide accountability for the American people. It's a very unusual job. It's a 15-year term, the longest term of any position in government that has a term. And it's just the appointment is done through a very unique process. You have 10 leaders of the Congress, 5 from the Senate, 5 from the House, bipartisan, bicameral. They have to come up with a list of at least 3 candidates, and then they send the list to the President. The President then has to pick a nominee. The Senate has to confirm. In my case, in 1998, there were over 60 people considered, and ultimately I was the one that was nominated and confirmed unanimously by the Senate. But when I came into office, we had a surplus in fiscal 1998, which ends September 30. We had projected surpluses going into the future. So while I knew that we had challenges dealing with Medicare and Social Security, they were out of ways, and our short-term and medium-term finances were in pretty good shape. So I wasn't as concerned about it. But what ended up happening is I saw that the budget controls that provided fiscal discipline from the early 90s until 2002 were not going to be extended, in part because we had gone from large and growing deficits to large and growing surpluses. And as a result, once they expired, things went out of control. And so in my position, I started speaking out. I did as much as I could, but ultimately I saw that some of the things that needed to be done I couldn't do in that job, because after all, I did work for the Congress, and Congress was part of the problem, but they also needed to be part of the solution.
So March of 2008, it's pretty controversial for you to say I'm resigning. What was the cause of that? What influenced that?
Well, what influenced it was, and candidly, I planned to stay the entire 15 years. And what ended up happening was Pete Peterson, who is a businessman who was fortunate to make quite a bit of money when Blackstone, a private equity firm that he helped to found, went public, has been a long-standing advocate of more fiscal responsibility. He's written several books on it. Pete's about 84 right now, and he wanted to do something as part of his legacy, and so he basically pledged $1 billion to create a foundation, $1 billion of what he achieved through that sale, to create the Peter G. Peterson Foundation that would be dedicated to fiscal responsibility and accountability. And he recruited me from my position as Comptroller General of the United States. And at first I resisted, because it was a great job and I was doing great and things were going great. But he ultimately convinced me that I had done everything I could in that job, and that it would be better for me to be on the outside trying to do some things that otherwise I couldn't do. For example, as Comptroller General, you can't advocate specific solutions. You can't bring pressure on Congress to act and hold it accountable if it fails to act, because they're your client. And so ultimately I decided to do that. And the last reason is that when I became Comptroller General, I had established 3 key objectives for myself. And I had already accomplished the first 2, The remaining one was what I'm working on now. And ultimately, when I was convinced that I could do more on the outside than the inside, that's why I made the change.
Interesting. So I visualize Comptroller General. So that's an accountant. I visualize the accountant having many responsibilities financially. Did you ever worry about maybe writing a check or writing something out where maybe you may bounce, or did you guys ever pay over limit fees, any of that stuff with?
Well, first, it's important to understand what the job is and what the job isn't. As Comptroller General of the United States, you're basically the Auditor General. You're basically the Chief Accountability Officer of the U.S. government. GAO did financial audits, program evaluations, policy analyses, legal research, opinions, adjudications. The people who are responsible for keeping the books, the people who are responsible for paying the bills are in the executive branch. It's the Treasury Department that are responsible for that. They run the Bureau of Public Debt as well. And so we're basically overseeing them. We're the ones that issue the audit report on the federal government each year. So we're the accountability part. We're not management. We're independent accountability professionals.
Perfect. Okay, so
don't blame me for where we're at, because we're not management.
So here's a question. 08, I mean, for me, sometimes, we see on TV, we have this much debt, this is going on, that's going on, this going on, and life goes on the way it is. So sometimes you see this, and they say national debt, 15 trillion, that we have $15 trillion, and in 08, it was only $11 trillion or $10 trillion. What does that mean to the average middle American income family making $80,000 between husband and wife? What does that mean to them?
Well, unfortunately, the number is a lot bigger than 15. Let me kind of give you an executive summary. From George Washington, our first president, to William Jefferson Clinton, our 42nd president, we accumulated $5.6 trillion in debt. And under George Walker Bush, 43, and President Barack Obama, we've gone from 5.6 trillion to 15 trillion plus, and adding debt at record rates. But that's not the real problem, because the problem is not just the debt that you see, it's the off-balance sheet obligations that don't represent deficits and debt today, but they will in the future absent a changing course. Underfunded Medicare, $37 trillion. Underfunded Social Security, $9 trillion. A range of commitments and contingencies that, as I said, don't represent deficits and debt today, but they will in the future. Let's translate that. The total liabilities and unfunded promises for the federal government as of September 30, 2011, $65.5 trillion. That's over $200,000 per person, over $550,000 per household. Median household income in America is about $50,000. So that means under our status quo, do-nothing path, the typical American household has a second or third mortgage equal to 11 times their annual income and no house to back that mortgage.
So that's $65 trillion worth of time. That's a lot of money. What can we do about it? What can the families do about it?
Well, first, people need to understand that the government has grown too big, promised too much, and waited too long to restructure. It's ultimately going to have to make tough choices. It's going to have to reimpose tough budget controls, tougher than the ones that we had in the 90s because we're in worse shape. It's going to have to reform Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid to make them focused much more on those in need and to be more means-tested. It's going to end up having to reduce defense and other spending without compromising national security. And it's going to have to engage in comprehensive tax reform and ask for more revenue. So the bottom line is, it's going to do less and tax more. And so what does that mean? That means that the not-for-profit sector is going to have to do more, and that means individuals are going to have to assume more personal responsibility and accountability. They need to plan, save, invest, and preserve their savings. They need to have a budget. Oh, by the way, the government hasn't had a budget for 3 years. And it's the only thing that the Constitution says the government's supposed to do every year. There's only one thing.
How is that possible?
Because there's no sanction. If they don't have a budget, there's no sanction. By the way, I'm also one of the founders of a new group called No Labels. You can check it out at nolabels.org. It's for Republicans, Democrats, Independents who believe we're in serious trouble. We need to promote progress over partisanship, results over rhetoric. And one of our proposals under the Make Congress Work agenda is no budget, no pay. If you don't get a budget on time, if you don't do the appropriations bills, no pay. And that ultimately that'll motivate them to pass one, but no retroactive pay. So that's what they typically do. When you have a government shutdown, people don't work, and they retroactively pay people for not working, including themselves. It's an outrage.
So, okay. One of the things that, in business and life when we work is I hear about, well, there's two things you never talk about. One is religion you never talk about, and you don't talk about politics. Okay. I also heard, those who say, studying politics isn't something you should do are led by other people who do study politics. So you're sitting here saying, the government's doing this, the government's doing that. What is the role of the government? I mean, if you could explain that in 1 minute, 2 minutes, what does the government do? What are they there for?
Well, first, we've strayed quite a bit from what the founders intended. When you look at the express and enumerated responsibilities that the founders envisioned for the government, it was really for government to do things that the private sector either couldn't or wouldn't, and that individuals themselves couldn't do by themselves, that there were collective needs. There were things like national security, homeland security, judicial system, postal service, Congress, executive office of the president, things that realistically you couldn't expect the private sector to do and individuals couldn't do on their own. Now, here's the interesting thing. The federal government has gone from 2% of the economy in 1800 to 24% today, headed to 37% by 2040. In addition, of what the government spends money on every year, less than 40% relates to the express and enumerated responsibilities envisioned by the founding fathers. So not only has it gone from 2% of the economy to 24%, but less than 40% of what it's doing relates to what the founders intended. So the truth is, we need to have an honest discussion about what government should do, how it should do it, and who should pay for it. Because it's grown too big, promised too much. It needs to get out of some of the things that it's doing. It needs to devolve some of the things the federal government's doing to state and local government. And we have to keep in mind the principles that we were founded on. Let me mention just a few that are relevant to this group. Limited but effective government. Individual liberty and opportunity. Rule of law and equal justice under the law. Personal responsibility and accountability. And fiscal responsibility and intergenerational equity. We were founded on those principles and others, and we are violating every one of them right now. And so unless and until we end up coming back to our founding principles, we're going to be in trouble. And that's why it's so critically important that people be informed and involved, because the only way we're going to change things is if the first three words of the Constitution come alive. And what are they? We, the people, are responsible and accountable for what does or does not happen. And unless and until those three words come alive, then we're not going to change course.
In the book, you talk about how initially when politicians were created, whether it was Franklin, Jefferson, Washington, it was a part-time job. It wasn't something they did full-time. How did that evolve from the part-time to the full-time? I want to grab your book when you answer that.
Sure. Well, when the founders created this great republic in 1789, they envisioned that being in elected office would be public service. And it would be something that you would do for a short to medium period of time, and that you would work in the real world. You would leave your real world job for a short to medium period of time, do public service, and then return to the real world, which kept people grounded. They also didn't envision that Congress would end up passing laws that it would exempt itself from. basically saying you got to follow these rules, but we don't have to follow these rules, whether it's insider trading or labor laws or environmental laws or anything else, all right? So that's the height of hypocrisy. What we have today, unfortunately, is a vast majority, and there are some exceptions, but a vast majority of elected officials today at the federal level are career politicians. They may or may not have had a real job in their life, but once they get elected, they don't, and they want to keep it for life. That is not conducive towards telling the truth, towards making tough choices, and that's exactly what we need right now, because our ship of state is heading for an iceberg that could sink it. And we need truth, we need transparency, we need tough choices so that we can avoid that iceberg and so that we can stay great and our future can be better than our past.
So, absolutely. So you talked about, with the government and their roles and what they do. Let's talk about free enterprise, free market, and who creates jobs. We have the unemployment right now, that's the one that's advertised being 8.5, 8.9, whatever the numbers they're given, and you hear about the 16%, the 15%. And yes, the government creates jobs. So who really creates jobs? Who can really turn this economy around?
Well, first, the numbers that are advertised on unemployment and underemployment are lowballed, because the way that they count today is different than how they used to count. Once you become disheartened to the point that you no longer look for a job, you're not counted anymore. And so once the economy starts to recover somewhat, you're actually going to see that some people that haven't been looking for a job may end up start looking for a job. And so I think that because we've been eating our seed corn too long, unemployment is going to remain high for a period of time. And part of that's because of the skills gap that we have in this country. But the bottom line on your answer is, look, government plays important roles. I'm not an anti-government person. But the fact of the matter is, government is not the engine of growth, innovation, and job creation. The private sector is. And so government can do things that will create jobs temporarily, but if anything, government, as I said, has grown too big. And so if anything, it needs to be smaller, not bigger. And what it has to do, it has to create a climate that will facilitate growth in the private sector. That means innovation. That means having tax laws and regulatory policies that are understandable, can be complied with, that are fair. And in many regards, I think what we found is that our tax laws are an abomination. They're way too complicated. There's a lot of inequities. They don't generate enough revenues. Our regulations, we have way too many regulations. We do regulation on regulation on regulation. And in both cases, we'd be a lot better off if we made them a lot simpler and we enforced them. Because right now we've got way too much, way too complicated, and they're not enforced to the extent that they need to be.
So how do we do that?
You have to get a president of the United States who is a transformational change agent, who is willing to tell the truth to the American people. And I'm not saying that Barack Obama can't do this. He hasn't done it yet, but I'm not saying he can't do it. You have to get one that will go to the American people, tell them the truth about where we are, let them understand the tough choices, and provide leadership. The Congress is a committee. You can't run a country by committee. And it's dysfunctional. You've got one party against the next. You've only got one chief executive officer in the United States, and that's the President of the United States. I'm talking about for the federal government. And so, the President has to lead. Congressional leaders need to follow on a bipartisan basis. But for that to happen, I come back to what I said before. The first three words of the Constitution have to come alive. We the people.
I remember, definitely. I remember, for me, I didn't go to college. I got out of high school, I went straight to the military, and then I got out. And when I was in Iran and were living there, when the revolution took place, my parents, we lived there for 10 years in Tehran, just a few minutes away from the main church, main things that were taking place. And we escaped and we came here, and from 2 years we went to Germany at a refugee camp, then we came to U.S. And I remember an interview that was done with the son of the Shah, and the question was asked, how can we get Iran back to what it was? Because Iran was beautiful. Iran was a place a lot of people would go to vacation in 60s, 70s. It was a place with a lot of history. And all of a sudden, that thing's gone. And his response was this, and I'm just curious to know what you think about this, is the only way Iran can get their own revolution and possibly get the freedom back is to get the younger generation to start studying and having their own opinion about politics and policies. What do you think is the responsibility the 25, 30-year-old, 35-year-old can play in bringing back, restoring America as what it used to be just a few years ago?
Well, as you know, Iran used to be Persia, and Persia was one of the greatest civilizations in the history of mankind.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some lessons there. Persia, Greece, the Roman Republic, there are a number of great civilizations that have existed throughout history. And they've fallen. They've fallen because they strayed from the principles and values that made them great. We must not allow that to happen in the United States. Now, to answer your question, young people are not engaged in this fight nearly to the extent that they need to be.
I agree.
The fact of the matter is, three things are happening to young people right now. Their future is being mortgaged at record rates. Investments in their future are being cut at a time that they're going to face a lot tougher competition in an increasingly competitive and interconnected global marketplace. That is not only irresponsible, it is unethical, it is immoral, and it needs to change. But for it to change, young people are going to have to become informed and involved. Ignorance and apathy are a toxic mix, and young people are going to have to get involved disproportionately as compared to their share of the population. In other words, they're going to have a higher market share in turnout for elections, in activism, if they want to make a difference. In 2008, young people turned out in record numbers. But you know what? It was no big deal because everybody else did too. And so the fact is that young people not only have to turn out in record numbers, they have to turn out disproportionately. They have to use social networking. They have to use other mechanisms to create virtual marches. They have to be much more visible with regard to town hall meetings, with regard to other events. They have to get in the face of these people that are mortgaging our future and pushing our country off a cliff.
We talked about this last night briefly where, growing up as a kid, you automatically look at your parents as your heroes. And typically whatever they believe in, you're going to believe in, no matter what it is. Whether it's religious, politics, it's just kind of how it works. And then it comes to a time where we're grown-ups and we sometimes no longer create our own opinion. That opinion just sometimes lasts. What do you think, person who's sitting there saying, well, because many times I think we vote with emotions than we do with logic to find out who's going to be the better leader to run a nation. How does somebody who's been raised to have a certain opinion, how do you go out there and educate yourself to be more clear on your opinion on which direction to go?
Well, first, a couple of things that are generally accepted, or popular sayings. I won't say generally accepted. When you're young, you think your parents know everything. When you're teenagers, you think they know nothing. After you end up getting into the real world, it's amazing how much your parents have learned in the last few years, okay? The other thing is let me say this before I say this. I am a political independent, and I'm proud of it, okay? But let me say that. But when you're young, people say that if you're not a Democrat, you don't have a heart, okay? And then when you're older, if you're not a Republican, you don't have a head, okay? The answer is be an independent, don't worry about it, okay? So, look, you need to go to trusted sources. There's so much, information, disinformation, misinformation that's out there. You have to go to trusted sources for information. If you look at our media, it's very fragmented, okay? You've got media that pitch to the right. You've got media that pitch to the left. You've got media that uses humor and parody, if you will. It's not the same situation it was when our parents were growing up, where you had three main networks and you had a trusted person, that you could go to, like Walter Cronkite. If you lost Walter Cronkite, you lost America. That's what the saying was, but we don't have that anymore. And so as a result, since you've got so many opportunities to get information, you have to decide who the trusted sources are. And I strongly recommend that you also have to be able to make sure that you get some information as a supplement to that trusted source. Go to a source from the right, go to a source from the left, get a sense for what they're saying, and hear what both sides have to say, and then make up your own mind. By the way, one of the things I would like everybody here to do, take 5 to 10 minutes in the next few days, go to fiscaliq.net. That's fiscaliq.net. That is a 30-question, true, false, agree, disagree quiz on fiscal responsibility and sustainability. Over 40,000 Americans have taken it in the last 4 weeks, not a dime of advertising, all 50 states, 85 countries. Now here's the interesting thing. The lowest scores, minors, people under 18. That's kind of understandable because frankly our schools don't do a very good job of fiscal responsibility, fiscal literacy, financial literacy and civic responsibility. The second lowest score, anybody want to guess? Elected officials. The third lowest score, the media. Mainstream America is ahead of all these groups. We're the solution.
What books would you recommend? I mean, I'm just curious because when you read about Lincoln and you read different books that there's about him, there's always certain books he read right next to his bed. What are some books you would recommend reading?
Let me tell you without giving specific books, let me give you an idea. I'm a big history buff, okay? And I have read over the years and like to read more nonfiction than fiction because I'm still learning all the time, all right? So I like to learn about history, great moments in history, whether it's civilizations or countries or transformational periods. I also like to read about great leaders. Leaders who are inspirational, who were major change agents, people like Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, okay, Kennedy, Reagan. I mean, people who were real leaders. I also like to read about, trends, mega trends, and what are the trends that are facing, our country. And so you learn from history, you learn from others, you try to understand what the trends and forces are that are shaping the world to try to get a sense of where we're going so you can try to stay ahead of the curve, if you will. I'm happy to put together a list if you want and provide it to you, but I'm happy to do that.
Would love to. And I'm sure you guys wouldn't mind having that list, would you? Yeah, we're...
And of course, I won't put Come Back America on the list because you know that one already.
So let's get right into that because, I wanted to make sure we talk about the book as well, Come Back America. On Chapter 2, I want to talk about Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. Chapter 2, the title of it is Why We Must Act Now. Why must we act now, David?
I'm a big believer in learning from history and learning from others. And if you look to history, and if you look, for example, to Greece, to Rome, to great civilizations, we're repeating a lot of the mistakes that they made that caused their downfall. Secondly, when you look at statistics, financial statistics, the truth is our debt as a percentage of our economy and the path that we're on is as bad or worse than some of the countries that are in the news in Europe right now. And we are a temporary safe haven because we're the largest economy on earth. We have 62% of the world's global reserve currency and cause there's uncertainty in Europe. But the truth is, once Europe works through its problems within the next couple of years, people are going to start putting the microscope on us. And when they start putting the microscope on us, they're not going to like what they see. And so therefore, I believe it's critically important that in 2013, that we make some meaningful progress to start dealing with the structural deficits, to start being able to be on a path where our debt as a percentage of the economy can get to a more reasonable and sustainable level. It's taken us several decades to get where we are. It's going to take us a generation or more to get to where we need to be, but we need to start now. We need to avoid a tipping point. Bond vigilantes do not have duties of loyalty to countries. They're about making money. That's all they're about. And so the fact of the matter is, you cannot spend a lot more money than you make indefinitely without facing a day of reckoning. Today, the U.S. government continues to spend $3 billion a day more than it takes in, every day, including weekends. You cannot do that without facing a day of reckoning. And at the same time, I'm hopeful, because I look at the ranking of countries on fiscal responsibility and sustainability that we came out with. We're 28 out of 34 in a bad neighborhood. But number 1, 2, and 3, Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, they had major problems in the 90s. They rose to meet the challenge. They made tough choices. Now they're 1, 2, and 3, gold, silver, and bronze medal. I look to that. If they can do it, we can do it. And there are reform plans out there, the so-called Simpson-Bowles, Domenici-Rivlin, the Come Back America Initiative reform plans. There are a number of plans out there where the numbers work, and they ought to be able to get bipartisan support. But that's not going to happen until we, the people, come alive, and the president, whoever it is, makes it a priority. That's what it's going to take. So I want to do whatever I can, and I need your help, to try to make sure that we can maximize pressure so that we start making some progress in 2013. We're not going to see meaningful progress before the election, but it's imperative that we see it the first year after the election, irrespective of the results.
Ronald Reagan once said, we're all one generation away from losing our freedom. I mean, do you really believe we are one generation away from losing our freedom if we don't act now? I mean, is there really that kind of an urgency? Because there's so much you can think with that, saying, really, something's going to happen to America. I mean, David, we're America. Nothing's going to happen to America.
Well, the question is it going to be the America that we know, that we want, and that we love? America's not going to go away, but what's America going to be? I mean, I said in the IOUSA documentary that the greatest threat to the United States was not somebody hiding in Pakistan or Afghanistan, but it was our own fiscal responsibility. And in fact, if you look at the great civilizations on earth, one of the things that's a common denominator between their decline is government grew too big, people became too lazy, they became fiscally irresponsible with the public's resources, they overextended themselves militarily around the world, values declined in the country. I mean, that's what happened that brings great civilizations down, all right? So my view is that we are on a dangerous path, that the decisions that are made or that fail to be made in the next 3 to 5 years by elected officials will largely determine whether our future is better than our past. America will remain, but for America to stay great, for our future to be better than our past, and for the American dream to stay alive, to stay alive so that each generation has more opportunity than the last, we're going to have to start making some tough choices. We have too many people living for today, not enough people willing to make tough choices to help create a better tomorrow. And that's what it takes. By the way, leadership is about telling the truth, doing the right thing, even though it may not be popular. And transformational change leaders, by definition, are controversial players. Human beings don't like change. They resist change. And to make major change happen, you got to do two things. You've got to start with the masses, we the people. You've got to start at the top, the chief executive officer, and you got to move to the middle. And it doesn't make any difference whether you're in the private sector, the public sector, or the not-for-profit sector, whether you're a country, a company, or another organization. That's what it takes. So let's do it.
So how do we know what's good change, what's bad change? Because change is always being talked about. So anybody can get up and say, let's change it, but how do you know if it's a good change or a bad change?
Well, first, the United States has been a republic since 1789. It still has no plan. It has no strategic framework, future focused, trend-based, threat, risk, opportunity-oriented, outcome-focused, resource-constrained. Nothing. When you don't have a plan, you're flying blind. You can't fly blind in today's challenging times. So we need to develop a plan. In addition to that, we have to be able to determine what should the government do and how do we measure success. Success based on outcomes, all right? Look, attitude and effort matter. They absolutely matter. They matter a lot. But ultimately, it's results that count most.
Chapter 3, principles, from our founding fathers, from our history and common sense. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, and I'll come back to some of the things that I said before. This country was founded on a number of principles. Limited but effective government. Yes, we need government, but it should be only as big as necessary to do things that otherwise can't be done by others, and it needs to be effective. Secondly, individual liberty and opportunity. Not entitlement, opportunity. Personal responsibility and accountability. We're responsible for ourselves and for those that are within our community. And we need to be held accountable for what we do or what we fail to do as individuals, just as we need to hold our elected official accountable, not just for what they do, but what they failed to do. You got to keep in mind, as a fiduciary, you can breach your fiduciary responsibility not just because you did something that you shouldn't have done, because you failed to do something that you should have done. And in many regards, that's where the failures are today. You have rule of law and equal justice under the law. Look at what happened in 2008. Who the heck's been held accountable? Who's been held accountable for all the failures that occurred in 2008? I'll leave that to you, okay? Fiscal responsibility, I've said before, you can't spend $1.42 for every dollar you take in, charge it to the credit card, and expect that tomorrow is going to be better than today.
That's like what Bradley would do.
Well, unfortunately. But in addition to that, we've got to look at the issue. Look, this country was founded on a tradition of stewardship. Now, what does stewardship mean? Stewardship means that you don't just, generate positive results today. You don't just leave things better off when you left than when you came, whether it's a job or this world. But you leave things better positioned for the future. That means you don't mortgage the future. There's a lot of things that you can do to generate positive results today, but you're stealing from tomorrow. We are violating our stewardship responsibilities. We need to come back to these time-tested principles and values. We need to learn from history. We need to learn from others. We need to make tough choices, and we will. The question is, will we make them prudently, preemptively, or will we wait until a crisis is at our doorstep and the markets start punishing us with higher interest rates, higher unemployment, higher inflation? Will we wait for that? God, I hope not.
Let me ask you, I look at a lot of my friends that we grew up with, and I see some of them are extremely lazy. And if we take that family and we put the father and the mother of that family as the presidents and the vice presidents, just like parents sometimes may raise kids that are given everything for free and they become too spoiled, is the word, can a system or an institution create, because you talked about laziness earlier, can a system or an institution or a government create lazy people?
Well, first, as parents and grandparents, you can do everything you can, but you're not always successful. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't give 110%, because every human being is different, and everybody's wired differently, if you will. I will say this, that in order for any system to be successful and sustainable over time, you have to have three things. is whether it's government, the private sector, the not-for-profit sector, or frankly in your personal life. You have to have properly designed and integrated incentives that encourage people to do the right thing, that encourage positive behavior and discourage negative behavior. Secondly, you need to have adequate transparency to provide reasonable assurance that people will do the right thing because a variety of parties are looking. And thirdly, you need to have appropriate accountability if people fail to do the right thing. Now, I hate to say this, but there are several systems in our society today where we are 0 for 3. That's called a strikeout. And I'll give you 3 examples. Number 1, our healthcare system. Number 2, our K through 12 education system. And number 3, our executive compensation system.
I can sit here and talk to you for hours and enjoy it and learn a bunch of different things with you, but let's talk about a different side of David Walker. I mean, you know, you're an accountant. How many guys can tell how brilliant David Walker is, by the way, right? This is very interesting on the intelligence, the answers. It's obviously very impressive, but I don't visualize you being somebody where on your free time you're sitting there doing calculus and formulas, right?
No.
What do you like? What does David Walker like to do for fun? I know you're a sports guy.
Well, my wife and I, and then when our kids were in the house, there were 3 things that we like to do, in common. One, the kids like going to the beach, but I can only handle the beach for a couple of days. I'm very fair-skinned, and I'm a type A personality. Secondly, downhill skiing. Thirdly, cruising. We actually like cruising despite what happened this last week. We're still going to go on a cruise to Southeast Asia in March or whatever. But I like to read. I like sports, if you will. Frankly, I don't have enough spare time. My wife will tell you that. She's trying to push me to achieve a better work-life balance, not travel as much, especially on the weekends. But at least she's here with me today, so I appreciate that, Mary. Thank you very much.
So the last thing before we, finish off the interview is choosing leaders, because at the end of the day, voting is you choosing a leader that you can count on for whatever that period is, whether it's 4 years, whether it's 8 years, whether it's 15 years. You need to choose the leader. And as somebody who's looking out there, and there's a lot of things going on TV right now with the debates and the CNN debates and the Fox debates and all these other things taking place, how does one sit there and say, well, who do I vote for? Because voting's coming up and it's election 2012. How do you look at, what things do you look at and say, okay, this is the way I'm going to go. This is the direction I got to go. What would you say about that?
Well, first, the way that I do it, as I said, I'm a political independent. I don't believe that either political party has a monopoly on the best ideas or the best people.
Absolutely.
And I believe that everybody ought to do their homework and try to vote for who the best person is, no matter whether they're a Democrat, Republican, or an independent or libertarian, whatever that might be. But my view is that you have to look at the job, and you have to look at what kind of attributes are necessary in order to be successful in that job. If I look at President of the United States, or if I look at governor, or if I look at mayor, for example, those are chief executive officer jobs. That's what they are, okay? Now, they're not chief executive officer for a private sector enterprise because they're dealing with a political body. And their board of directors, in the case of the federal government, it's the Congress. In the case of the state government, it's the state legislature. And in the case of mayor, it's the city council. And so you have to have somebody who's qualified to be a chief executive, but who knows how to get things done in a political environment. So let me translate that to president as an example. When I think of president, a president is several things. Number 1, commander-in-chief of U.S. forces. And everybody knows that, and that gets talked about. And frankly, sometimes I think it's talked about too much, all right? Secondly, the person who sets foreign policy for the United States. Thirdly, something that doesn't get talked about enough, the symbol of America. The single person that is viewed as the symbol of America around the world. Fourthly, Chief Executive Officer of the United States government, a government that lost $1.3 trillion last year, has a $14.8 trillion negative net worth, $65.5 trillion in total liabilities, unfunded obligation, is losing market share in the world and is losing its competitive posture. So, but that can be turned around with, and you said the key word, leadership. The biggest deficit this country has is leadership. We had way more than our fair share of leaders when we were founded. We have way fewer than our fair share of leaders today. And so what we have to do is be very careful to make sure that we pick people who are qualified for the job and who have the right character, because character counts.
Which also, I mean, if you look at that from a outsider, it opens up an opportunity for not a lot of next generation leaders to rise up, you know, with an opportunity like that. But you said something earlier as well, as when it comes down to how to elect somebody, you think it's important for somebody to lead a country to have had experience leading maybe a company, leading an organization, maybe military? You think that's required? Is that needed?
In my view, if you're electing a chief executive officer, you need to have somebody who has considerable leadership experience and a proven track record of success leading. That's different than the Congress, which is a legislative branch. But for the chief executive officer, I think that's critical. Because if the president isn't going to provide the leadership, if the governor does not provide the leadership, if the mayor does not provide the leadership, you're probably not going anywhere fast. You know, look at our Congress. It's dysfunctional. It's got an 11% positive rating. My question is, who the hell are these 11%? You know? I mean, you know, and let me end on this, okay? I mean, I don't
Probably
think
their own relatives and their family
I don't
members
think they
and
have
friends.
that many, at least not that many that would claim to be, but in any event. Look, here, let me leave you with this, all right? We live in a great country, probably the greatest in the history of mankind, but we're not as great as we think we are. We've strayed from the principles and values that made us great. We need to come back to them. We need to learn from history. We need to learn from others. We need to tell the truth. We need to make tough choices. And if we do that, America will stay great, our future will be better than our past, and the American dream will stay alive. But again, I'll do my part. You need to do yours. We, the people, have to come alive. You need to help yourselves. You need to help your clients, your customers, and your community, and you need to help your country, because it's worth fighting for, and this is the fight for the future of America and the fight for the future of our families. In 1992, Ross Perot, who's a friend of mine, ran for president for the first time. On the issues we're talking about today, he ran on four things: fiscal irresponsibility by government, political dysfunctionality in government, declining trust in government, and declining confidence in the future. The truth is, based on objective statistics, we're worse on all four. But here's the story within the story. He didn't win, but he woke up the people, and he caused President Clinton to have to make these tough choices a priority. We improved on all of those measures dramatically between 1993 and 2000. But we've lost our way since 2002. What we did before, we can do again. Let's do it. I need your help. Thank you.